Time to settle in for the nice long nap. The one you never wake up from. Too dark?
What's bringing this on?
Don't you forget about me. How's your library code going, man? You writing some library code just to make an app?
I am.
Yeah, me too. We're writing surprisingly similar library code together.
Yeah, I'm. What do you want to explain what it is?
No, we just get into it.
I'm just so defeated in battling library code.
So we have been just hacking on side projects kind of independently, but we both use. Do you use Firebase Auth too?
Yep.
Yeah. So we have next projects that use Firebase for auth and Hasura for the data layer. And we wanted to start writing tests for these apps. And it turns out that there's a bit of work to get that all wired up. Turns out a lot of these services don't really prioritize testing in the way that we'd like. Is that accurate? Is that fair?
It is. I think it's really hard for them. So like we're using Hasura as our backend. And I think it's really hard for them to provide good testing tools. So the only testing tool that they provide is this thing called regression tests, which basically you can have it like, I'm just going to gloss over this. You can have it snapshot GraphQL queries, and then you start changing data, tables, migrations, whatever. And then you can assert that those same GraphQL queries run against your server after you made a bunch of table changes, return the same data. Mm-hmm. But that, like, okay, that's great if my job is to run a bunch of Postgres servers and maintain the Hasura instance. But if I'm an app developer, it's freaking useless because it doesn't tell me if my app is working or not. And it doesn't let me test how my app interacts with data that comes from Hasura, which is
the whole point.
The thing that we need. Yeah, the whole point. But in their defense, it's, what are they supposed to do? Provide like a JavaScript testing library, an iOS testing library, like a server-to-server testing library? Like they would end up just writing testing libraries all day. And you know what I mean? Because how you use Hasura is not, we're using it through Java from a JavaScript client. But they're in their docs, like they like say you can use this from mobile, and you can it can power mobile backends, and it can power server-to-server backends. So they're not just a thing they're not just a backend for JavaScript web clients.
Right. So
it's tricky. It's tricky to be in their shoes. But unfortunately, that pushes a lot of the testing stuff onto us.
Right.
Is what we're going through this week.
Right. I have a question. When you were back in your Rails days, digging deep in memory here, ancient lore, can you think of like some of the apps you worked on that used the most services, like Stripe and Amazon? And among those projects, like, did you ever have a setup from the testing side that you were really happy with? What were the testing utilities that those libraries provided like?
Yeah, sure. So like, I mean, when I think of services as like anything that needs to be running, providing an API for your Rails app. So at one end, you have like things like Postgres, which is just kind of like, you don't really think of it as a service, but it is something that needs to be running for the Rails app. And then at the other end, you have something like, like Stripe that you mentioned, something that's more like higher level, a bunch of APIs. So like
external, you never can run it locally the way you can Postgres, basically.
Right. So things like Postgres and Redis, you just run them locally, and in like your Rails config for like the test environment, you just have it use like an _test database, and for both like Redis and Postgres. So you're still going to run that stuff locally, but it's not, it's stuff that's already like running on your computer for dev. You don't really think of it as an external service.
Can I pause here for a second, actually? Yep. I think it's interesting because like Postgres and to a large extent Redis are like standard issue when it comes to Rails apps. So there's been a lot of investment in tools and educational materials to help new Rails devs get those things running. I mean, even in my past, like there's been times where it's a pain in the butt to get it running for whatever reason, right? It's
I mean, you end up on projects that like for whatever reason for good reasons, but they need like a special Postgres config,
right?
And so like now you can't just run Postgres on your computer, and so
it's a paper cut.
Yeah, definitely a paper cut.
But
that is where Postgres starts to move into more of a like, okay, this is something special. It kind of takes on that shape of like the external service,
right?
Even though it's just Postgres,
right?
Quote unquote, just Postgres,
right?
It's having that those special requirements, special needs.
But then beyond that, what we're gonna go ahead and continue. What you're gonna say?
Yeah. So then you have things like Stripe, AWS. For Stripe, there was a great library called Stripe Mock where you could feed it, like you could say like, here's a credit card number. And if you get an API request about this credit card number, I want you to reject it with this code. Stripe has, credit cards that are not just success and fail.
Mm-hmm.
They reject with millions of different reasons, like not enough funds, different address verification failed. There's so many. So having a library like Stripe Mock where you can feed it credit cards and then feed it a response associated with the credit cards and then have your app start pinging, the stubbed out Stripe service and test that Stripe Mock is providing was really cool.
That wasn't maintained by Stripe, right?
No, it wasn't. I was just about to say, I think we did run into some issues where Stripe would release a new version and people were like, oh, does it work with this new version? Not that Stripe was making breaking changes, is more that, this library was just meant to mock out a few things. Mm-hmm. It's not meant to like be like a replacement for Stripe. I mean, that's, a business in itself.
Right.
The AWS stuff, I know that we would have like test S3 buckets and stuff like that, or if we needed to, we could use it. But there was like, we kind of had like a seam where like most of the things that interacted with AWS were things like our background jobs. And so you could like mock the AWS stuff, or there was just such little code in there, they weren't well tested. Mm-hmm. If you were testing a background job, you make a job file that basically has a perform function, and it gets some data and mm-hmm. does something. Like it gets some data and then it goes off and modifies a record in a database. Like think of like the job workflow. So you're really just sort of testing that perform function. And if it had AWS calls, I would tend to just mock those. Just because like, you don't want to set up test AWS environments. I mean, think about that. Like, what does it mean to set up a test AWS environment? Like you're spinning up a whole VPC, a whole new bucket for like every test run. And that just you'll spend all day writing test code.
Yeah.
And, so yeah, for that stuff. Yeah, exactly. So for that stuff, I would do the mock. And it was also like most of the Rails apps that integrate with AWS are doing like very, not, how do I say this? Like not complicated things. I mean, maybe they're complicated, but from like the app's point of view, it's just like a few API calls and then expecting a response. Mm-hmm. So, it's easier to get away with mocking in that situation.
Right. Right.
If I'm trying to get the name of all the files on S3, I can mock that.
Right.
And then things like the Rails tooling was great here. Also, just I kind of mentioned Sidekick and the background jobs. Rails has the great test support for that stuff, so you don't actually need to be running all that stuff in test mode. You can say like, okay, like when I make this API request, assert that a job was queued up to verify the user on Stripe, something like that, to verify that the user was like canceled on Stripe, something like that. Yeah. And so you're not actually testing the Stripe thing; you're just testing that the job was queued up.
Yeah. Yep. And that comes with Sidekick.
Yeah, I actually think that comes with Rails. So Rails has a active job. I never remember the name of the Rails stuff, and then I remember, oh yeah, you just put the word active in front of everything.
Yeah.
and then so
Active mailer.
Yeah, I think that one's action mailer.
Oh yeah.
Maybe that's
Active
it. Maybe
JavaScript.
It's action.
DHH's own flavor of JavaScript.
Dude, maybe I just totally like botched that whole joke. Maybe it is like action job. I think it's active job, but I'm not sure. But that thing is like the adapter pattern where you like all the background job libraries like delayed job and sidekick have the same interface.
Right.
And so active job
again sounds familiar.
Yeah, exactly. Active job wraps that, and then they provide all the test helpers. So I could like, I've never done this, but just like with Active Record, I could technically switch from like delayed job to sidekick, or sidekick to rescue, just like you could switch from Postgres to MySQL.
Right.
My tests should all just pass. Right. But like I said, I've never done that. So.
Right. But even if you never do it, the seam is there from the beginning.
Yeah.
So,
and it's amazing to be like, how do I test my background jobs?
Right.
And you just open up the Rails guides, and it's like, should be enqueued with, or whatever the thing is. And it's like, oh, that's so easy.
Yeah, that's awesome. Even if you don't use multiple providers in production, the seam is already built into your code, right? So when you go to test, you can inject a different, like a test provider, which is really nice.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's amazing. Because you need to test, right?
Yeah. But it's not something that you really think about a lot when you're using these services. So kind of to circle back, 4 or 5 weeks ago, go ahead.
Wait, can I just say you just hit the nail on the head, because I often see people like kind of like taking a dump on Rails on Twitter and saying things like, how often do you actually switch from MySQL to PostgreSQL? Yeah. That you don't need an ORM, you don't need Rails, you're never ever going to do this. You're never going to switch. Yeah. But it's not about switching. It's about having that seam. Yeah. So when you test, you can
totally
really good.
And it's like it's recursive, the idea, or layered or whatever, because this is true of a lot of code where as you add seams, you make the code more testable. I mean, it's one of the arguments behind the test-driven design stuff, which I've always thought was really dogmatic, but there's the kernel in there is like, when you inject dependencies, you make any object, any piece of code more testable, whether it's an application or a service, like an injector that uses a service, you can inject something just down to functions that take in arguments, right? So there is a general idea there, but there's also a cost to making code, like that. But specifically for this service integration stuff, it's really important. And so kind of going back, if you've listened maybe 4 or 5 episodes ago, or I guess over the past, 4 or 5 episodes, we've been talking about using like module state and Zestan to wire up Firebase and how simple it is. Ended up with like an 80-line like use auth hook that just uses module scope, and you just import Firebase, you follow the guides, and you have this like reactive store. And, the store's like current user can reference like firebase.get user, like get current token or whatever. If you need to authenticate your mutation request or log out, you just reference firebase.auth.logout. And so you end up with something really nice, but it's like highly coupled. And so, I had gotten to a point where on my fitness app, this both goes for Firebase and Hasura, where basically, I had made like the first version of it really fast. And then there was another time you and I were hacking on it and we added features like really fast. And I remember you said this thing, you were like, man, this reminds me of like my Rails days, where it's just like, you're just adding features to the app. And like, we added like 3 or 4 features in like an hour, because it was just, Hasura was there. We didn't have to write any endpoints. We didn't have to write tests for those endpoints. We didn't have to do anything like that. It was just able to build new features without changing basically anything on the back end. And it was pretty awesome. But you do end up with like a lot of coupled code there. especially in terms of where you integrate the service. So for that example, if your use auth hook is referencing Firebase, then how are you going to run your app in a test environment or offline? You're not, is the answer.
Yeah. I mean, go even deeper. You have like a current user profile picture component, and that thing just imports Firebase and grabs the current user, and hey, guess what? That works.
Yeah.
Until you need to test it.
Mm-hmm. So it's really cool using these things because it's so fast, but obviously we love testing when we do, any sort of production app that's not a side project. We test every app we've ever worked on. I can't think of a single app where we haven't had test, or a consulting project where we haven't started any other added test, or, tested everything we built, because that's just how we work. But, when you're hacking for a day, it's fun to just go to town. And especially like the guides of these things do kind of just show you, they want you to get some victories as fast as possible. But I got to a point with my app where, it's data driven. So it all depends on the day. And worse than that, there's like events that are time based in this app. And so it rolls over every week and shows you like how many times you worked out last week and how many times you ate well, or, drank too many beers or whatever. So if you're working on it on Sunday and then it's like midnight.
Sounds like you got sounds like you got a busy Monday.
Yeah, exactly. It's midnight 01, and that's what they call it, right? That then all of your UI is like breaks, right? You can't, or it just changes. So anyways, got to a point where this app I really did want to start, and I wanted to practice testing an app backed by Hasura and what that was like. I want to get more reps in with Cypress and all this stuff. And I just want to be able to boot up my app and like work on a screen in various different states. It's just interesting. So over the last week or two, I've been refactoring that code that I ended up with, and just today got to a pretty cool spot, where the this use auth store. Well, it's complicated by a few things, right? Is that first we had talked about having this hook that does all the auth stuff. And then I pulled the hook into a Zustand store that's outside of React, because if you think about it, kind of as we discussed, whether you have a session, whether the browser has like a cookie or like a Firebase session in local storage somewhere, whether you're signed in or not, and whether like your requester should have like a header when it's all of that has nothing to do with any pixels on the screen. And then furthermore, when you try to set these things up and you're inside React, you end up using an effect. You write a lot of defensive code. So it actually makes sense to do a lot of this stuff in module scope, which I think is going to be true for a lot of our code going forward, as they've referenced in some of the talks on suspense and the concurrent UI patterns. So you pull it out there, and now you have all this Firebase code that's running in module scope that's being set up. And so now you don't even have like the React apps lifecycle as a way to understand like when and how these things are running. Like they just run as soon as the code is imported. And so, basically all of this gets you to this spot where you had some really nice clean code that was easy to follow, but it was very coupled. And then when you try to test it, you can't really do it, right?
I mean, just the fact that you're nudge towards doing the stuff outside of React, and then so you set up Firebase and module scope, and then as soon as you do an import, now you're connecting to Firebase.
Yeah,
so like
exactly.
Your CI server is connecting to Firebase.
Exactly.
And that's like, maybe you can like work around that, but it feels uncomfortable. It feels like, oh crap, like I just splattered this.
Totally. So what I ended up with, and we can go into more details if we'd like, but what I ended up with is my little auth module pulled out into like this lib folder, because again, it has nothing to do with React actually, and use something like a provider pattern where you can inject different providers. You have like a Firebase provider, which had all my Firebase setup code. So a nice little module now, and it only ever runs, it's behind a function that's like initialized, and you only ever run that if you actually need to, if you're in the client and you're not in testing. So that's nice, because then I can just look at that and it literally looks like the guides. And then I have a test auth provider, which just does a few different things, mostly delegates to, right now, the window object for things like fetching a session, and logging out, because now I can provide those from the test itself using like sci.win to reference like the Mirage server that's running. So it ended up being pretty nice. And I think what I like about this is like this is a pretty generic pattern for like doing this sort of thing and going forward. Like if we integrate with more services, which feels just like it's the nature of things these days, it's pretty nice to have this kind of control over it. Now, this is after like a lot of exploration. Like we went down a lot of different paths. Kind of both of us did. First, it's kind of like, well, how do you test Firebase auth? And they provide an emulator that you can run. I think you have to run it in like Java on your computer.
Also, you have to like install Java because the Mac one is out of date. It's just
there's steps. There's the steps there.
Yeah, there's steps.
And then if you want to run it while you're running Cypress, you need to coordinate that. Again, we've been on a lot of projects where the Cypress setup requires a few different things to run, and it just is never smooth. Anytime you have to like have multiple processes running and stuff, it seems like it never is smooth. Just adding more moving pieces, right? And so went back and forth about that and tried to mock the Firebase stuff out, but that's like a total non-starter because Firebase is like a black box and you only interact with it through the modules. It's not like mocking out a Stripe API. It's very different. So that's just, it's way too opaque for you to actually properly like mock it at the HTTP layer.
It's also too like even if you like could do it, you should consider this like private API.
100%.
It's not made to be mocked.
100%. So that's where I landed. And again, it's nice because now I could actually change to auth 0 or on a feature project if it uses auth 0, or if I work with a team that's using a different way to do auth. This code would all be exactly the same. And it's really sweet. And then it's cool too because, I have code that kind of sets up SWR, and that code needs to fetch the session. Let's say you're already logged in and you open the app, you fetch the session, and then you need to kind of attach like the authentication header to the fetching library, right? And so you can do that because you just do like provider.fetch session. It returns a session with a token property, and you just attach that as an auth header. It's like a JWT. So it's pretty cool because like you could imagine basically adding any auth provider, and all you have to do is like implement a fetch session that returns an object with like a token. Boom, you're good.
So you could make like a use auth React hook package that just ships with a bunch of providers. And so
you could even make it. You could honestly, like, you could even make just the hook and store.
I'm saying you, as in like you.
Yeah, you could like part of the value here was just in thinking through what the pieces are and where the boundaries are. And honestly, like this is like a confirmation of some of the ideas that the testing folks. When I say the testing folks, I mean like the really dogmatic ones. But like the idea that the test driven stuff improves your design, like it does help clear it up because. If you look at my old file, you see dependencies kind of going in every direction. If you were to draw all the different pieces on a thing, you'd have errors going back and forth between all of them. The Firebase authenticates and then it sets the header on the data thing. The store calls into Firebase and then calls into the data. So it's nice. There's like a data module. And I think this is basically what I'm going to do going forward because it's just, it's nice. You look at data module, that's like your data layer. You have auth, that's your auth layer. And then you have like a coordinator that kind of does the init on your app's behalf that sets those things up. So the Firebase thing doesn't know anything about the auth thing or the data layer. The data layer doesn't know anything about the auth thing. In the sense, it doesn't reach into it. It's kind of an inversion, Whereas like before, I would have on auth changed, like Firebase has an on auth change callback that just calls back every time, and then you would just like update the store's current user or whatever. But now you can have the Firebase code provide like an on auth change function, and so then the use auth store can say, okay, provider, let me know whenever the auth status changes. Then I'm going to take care of updating the current user because that's my responsibility. And so now in the test, you can actually provide a test function, and you can call it. You could say auth did change with a null user. So like someone logged out in another browser, let me make sure my app is reactive and logs them out here. Or they're logged out here. Let's say they click an email link to sign in. The old browser signs in. So that's all really easy to do. It's also cool because I've wired up Suspense, and on the initial load of the app, I do an initial fetch of the session. And now from the test, since I can basically stub out, I have my test provider and I can say, what is fetch session? Like the initial fetch, I can just make it a promise, and I can just keep it in a pending state, assert against the spinner, and then call resolve and make sure it works. So it's pretty awesome.
That's really great, because a lot of times when you're testing loading states, you Cypress click a button and then hope that your assert for the spinner happens before that spinner disappears.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. It's really, really cool. Also, just all the other things I want to be able to do in local dev, which is like, we had a project where we were using Mirage and made a little UI that let you kind of quickly change states to see different flows of an app. So I'd like to be able to switch stuff, and to just also be able to switch that stuff on Firebase too is pretty awesome. So that's really cool. So it's kind of interesting. Then you have the data layer stuff, which is tougher because, Firebase has like 4 functions you call, and they either give yes or no. So let's just say, for sake of argument, there's 8 possible states you need to account for in all of your code for all Firebase integration, right? Like literally 8 possible outcomes. Obviously with Hasura, that's not the case because it's a generalized query language that has tons of responses. So the mocking story there becomes a lot trickier. And we kind of had a bunch of discussions over the past few weeks about that. We've had clients who ask about that, and we've seen folks go down the mocking route. We've seen folks try to go down the route where they get all their developers to be able to run the whole thing. I don't know. It's just been something that's on my mind because, part of me is like missing the times where everything's integrated. And from a test, for me, like a non-negotiable is in a test being able to say, create me a user, visit the home page, sign them in, visit the home page, show me that. Create me a user with 4 friends and 3 exercises, visit the home page and see that. If you look at Cypress, they have mocks built into it, but it's like static mocks. And you can use different files. But again, to me, I basically want the Rails API for testing with FactoryBot. It's just like
it's factories versus fixtures.
Yeah.
I this is, I don't know. This is non-negotiable for me as well. Like fixtures are just, they create a mess. There's just so much knowledge in the fixture files.
Yeah. But it's just kind of interesting. So like, I've talked about before, like maybe I should just use Firebase all together because it's really nice. You don't have to coordinate your data layer and your auth layer. How do you test all that stuff? I guess at that point you'd run the emulator, but
Firebase would love that if you just used Firebase for everything.
Yeah. But like, how are people writing tests for their stuff these days? Like, I don't know. It's just weird.
Yeah. I, just from the projects that I've been on, I do feel like this is, unexplored territory. And I think a lot of times, if first, I guess I would say, like, you look for something that's officially provided, right? Like, that's the first thing you look for. So like, is there an example of something? I guess like the active job stuff I was talking about, like they officially provide test support. So that's what you use. And you don't have to run all the job stuff. You don't have to start up Sidekick to write tests against your Rails app.
Right.
Second thing, I guess, is like you look for the Stripe mock stuff. So like unofficial, but tons of GitHub stars. And the third thing, which is like, I think what we're dealing with, is just you kind of you string together like the fastest thing to get you moving.
Yeah.
And I think that's where you get in trouble. But I think there's just so many services. I'm trying to think, like 10 years ago, were we using this many services? Like we were using AWS, but I think that's it. I mean, I think even the idea of like using another, like a SaaS service to provide your Postgres database was like, why would you do that?
Yeah.
Like, you're going to give someone else your Postgres database?
Yeah,
and
yeah,
now
yeah.
it's like,
take it all.
what buttons can I click?
Right.
What buttons can I click to get a Postgres database?
Exactly. Yeah.
So,
but it's like, the Supabase stuff and even like the Cart.js stuff, there's a lot of stuff that's like getting more popular these days. But the testing story is tough. But it's also tough if you obviously build it all. Or it's tough if you have to write it all, if you have to run a bunch of different things locally.
Yeah. Now I will say that Firebase auth is big. There's a lot of stuff in there, but you're not using it.
Totally.
All that stuff. Either am I. And so we've just sort of have the provider mock out the things we need in tests, which are, 3 or 4 functions.
Yeah. I'm happy with that. But it took me a while to get there, A. B, I don't think a lot of folks would necessarily get there especially if they were on a tight deadline. And just looking at the docs, not because I'm a better programmer, but because where you're nudged is like using the emulator, and there's just not a lot out there on this stuff. So that makes it kind of tricky. And even though I am happy with where I ended up, I'd much rather delete that code. It's not a lot of code, but I'd much rather delete it and just import, whatever. Mock sign in, mock create user. I mean, they have that stuff in the emulator suite, but I just don't want to run an emulator just to work on a front end. Like, there's something I really like. There is something I like about having seams in the front end code base for these services and then just testing your UI logic. That's basically all I'm writing anyways. Like, these guys are all taking care of the heavy lifting anyways. So I don't actually have to worry about that stuff as much. It's more just about getting those seams right,
I know, but that's if you were to take like 4 auth services and you were to compare them and then be like, okay, if I'm going to create providers for these 4 auth services so that I can have nice seams for testing, you would end up with a massive library because every auth service is going to maybe do something a little different, have an extra API call. So there is something nice about saying, here's a pattern I can use in my app, and I only need to provide the things from the service that I'm using. Yeah. So for something like Firebase, you're only using 3 or 4 things. That's easy. Yeah. Because you only need, it's easier to mock out 4 things than 25 things. Yeah. Where with Hasura, you wouldn't make like a data provider that provides like a get user by ID function.
For different backends or something.
Yeah, because that just gets, even though it's like going back like kind of against how we started this, like it does make testing easier because it's just one thing you need to swap in and out. But I guess it also comes down to like how much of a hole are you poking in reality? Yeah. Yeah. Which is true with like the Firebase mocking that we're doing. Like we could be getting error codes from Firebase that we don't have tested that we're not even accounting for.
Totally. So. My Firebase like provider code is, I can pull it right now. It's like it's really small, but that code is basically no longer covered, right? It's not covered by the test, but it's like a 40 line function, and most of it is just like half is config. So I'm okay with that because that's like such a light thing, Before I forget, I was going to say, like, going back to what I was saying, like, you could make a use auth hook that's just the interface and has different providers, and like that would be valuable open source wise because like you have nailed down a good interface that helps you understand. Someone might be thinking, oh, there's next auth, which exists and it's there, but like their testing guide left a lot to be desired. Maybe if I looked more at it, it'd be easy to work with, but it just felt like a lot too. So I just wanted to mention that. We can put a link to that in the docs. Maybe I should try using that. Link to that in the show notes. Maybe I should try using that in my next project just to go through their happy path, see what it's like. But it's just interesting, if you use an auth service like Firebase, it's like so hot in here. They just decided like Sam's the only one left in the building. We're going to smoke him out.
Dude, like 5:45, 5:50.
Turn off the AC.
Like it just goes dead quiet.
It just happened.
All the AC units shut off. Yeah.
You have your Firebase set up, And let's say you're using like one of their widgets, and you can like add providers by like going to the thing and clicking a button. But like now you can't test it. I mean, I guess that doesn't really matter because there's kind of like a layer there. It's like their responsibility. But like, yeah.
Well, it's you have to pick a seam. Like that's an awesome example because like, okay, you run the Firebase emulator, but then okay, now I'm doing sign in with GitHub
or Apple.
Okay, so now do I need like
dude,
I need like a GitHub emulator? Like I mean, obviously, I'm gonna say obviously not, but like maybe you do. Like this is all just stuff.
It's a spectrum.
A seam
it's a spectrum, and in that case, if you're using the pre-built Firebase sign-in widget, they're adding the services you've checked off. You have Apple, you have Google, you have GitHub. Obviously, you're not testing that stuff. That's provided to you. Where it's less obvious is things like, Hasura or I guess, different parts.
Well, I have an idea here. So just to kind of build off what you were saying, I've been doing the same thing. My Firebase setup is, it's not the same, but it's the same idea.
Mm-hmm.
So we're on the same page there. But I'm also working on setting up running Hasura locally to hit with tests and then throwing it away when I'm done and just repeating that over and over again. And they give you can run Hasura on your computer and it's, it's the same thing that you're running in prod. But it's not, I think one area that could be helpful is if they made it like they made the thing that you run on your computer. And I'm not just saying Hasura, I mean like all these services. They made it for testing purposes, not just for dev, not just for like, oh, this is how you set it up. So something that had like a, Hasura has like these like a JWT auth or webhook auth. Just, I don't really want to set that up and test. Right. I am because I need it to work.
Right.
But if there was just something where I could like quickly authorize or reject certain things, kind of like how that strike mock library, you can say like, oh, given this credit card number, this is the error you should get or the success you should get.
Right.
Making it easy to like reset the database. Right. So like Hasura doesn't have like a reset database.
Right.
You have to wire that up yourself.
Right.
So just like thinking of like, if someone was going to run this locally for testing, what sort of stuff do they need? I do like the idea of the emulators. I mean, I think they're a good idea. I think it's going to take a while for us to know like what emulators work well and which ones don't.
But maybe once you set up Hasura once locally, then you'll just do it every time. Just like if you were setting up a new Rails app, you wouldn't be starting off with SQLite. You would just start off with Postgres because that's what you're going to ship.
Exactly. What if there was a Hasura that was as easy to run
locally as it was to set?
To set Postgres and Rails. So something like it automatically resets my database between test runs, or I can wrap all my test code in transactions. And I don't know what this would look like, but it's very like the Rails testing has thought of this because these are the problems you run into when you're writing tests. And so they make this as easy as possible where you can do this in Hasura and it might be better for them. Like they're like not, they're a small company. Like it might be better for them to just say like,
kick the can.
Here's how you run Hasura on your computer. You can write all that code yourself.
Yeah.
But I think if we move to a world where our apps depend on 10 different services and we're running 10 different emulators, I would want those emulators to be like, I'm running you for a test. So I need ways to tell your emulator to do something, common situations that would come up in test. So
I guess it just, emulators for tests. Oh yeah. I guess, one thing that bothers me about like the JavaScript community is so fragmented. So we're not building off each other's shoulders as much as maybe the Rails community has, where you run into these problems eventually, but because everyone's sharing more stuff, they see the same things and have more shared solutions making it back. Like how could Next ever provide Cypress testing helper? They can't do it, right? Because they can't pick Cypress, even though a lot of people use it. And like, what would that even look like? Because they're agnostic about the back end.
But Rails did. Rails picked a testing framework. It was a lot smaller than Cypress.
I know, but everything is a company now. So now there's profit everywhere. And so you just ruined it. Capitalism has ruined everything,
Can that be our
show title?
No, our clip on Twitter.
Yes. Capitalism has ruined everything. If you know me, you know how funny that would be too.
What would Sam from 2 years ago think if he heard that?
/S. /S. No, but it does make it trickier, obviously, for Vercel to come out. Yeah, they want to keep Next, as like low level and flexible as possible. They are good tools, obviously, but it does bother me. Like I do have so much fun when I use them, especially for a new app. I mean, it's just so fast. But now I'm thinking like I'm just going back and saying, it's like you can make a mess real quick. It's not so much that it's a huge mess. I can work on it, but again, it really wasn't as much about the messy code. It was more about the testing stuff. And I want to just get tests in there and be able to work on stuff and know the rest of the app works and get automated dependency updates in there. All the stuff I'm just used to doing, and it's hard.
I just want to say, like, I'm kind of comparing this to like my time I was like really active in Rails. But I bet today, if I was working on a Rails app, I would be using a bunch of services. I bet you we would be using Auth0 and a whole lot more AWS.
I don't know, man.
And so
you'd probably be using Devise.
Have these problems. Yeah, I mean that's what I would reach for because that's what I know.
I mean, Devise and the database. Yeah, that's true. But then you'd want to like add like social sign-on and stuff, and then you would just use Auth0 or whatever. That is a good point. I would be interested to hear from like Rails, Laravel folks who are using it for side projects. Do they reach for services? I mean, shoot, man. It's true. Even just having Hasura and not having to write any of that stuff, having the auto-generate queries and mutations is just so awesome. It'd be tough to go back, I guess.
But by the way, this to me seems like. I think there's a lot of need in this area, and it seems like, when you're evaluating things like Supabase and Firebase and Hasura.
Basebase, that's a new one. I don't know if you heard of it.
Really?
Kidding. Got him.
Oh boy. Yeah, got him.
It's past 6.
When you're evaluating all these things, like
base,
what do we look like? Base. You look at like, oh, this one has GraphQL, where this one like has its own ORM layer, and I kind of want to use GraphQL because of this. But like, dude, having a really good testing story, like we thought about testing right out of the box, and it's not like an emulator or container that you run on your computer, but like here's how we test this stuff. That would probably push me over the edge.
I agree.
These things.
I agree. It's really about local development, like local first development and testing. That's a big part of it. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Like feeling like you're just not guessing and looking at like network logs and like, there's something to that. Jay Phelps, I was tweeting about this literally the evening I was working on my figuring out how to mock out Firebase. He says, how the heck does anyone write tests for Firebase or Firestore? Can't find any official solution, and community ones all appear to be incomplete or abandoned. A lot of people were recommending the emulator. I'm not sure where he ended up, but Stefan, our friend from the Ember community, said they were going back and forth, and Jay was just like, what am I supposed to do? Mock this out myself? Like, I have to re-implement this thing. And this is something else, we could touch on, but, I'm kind of going the Mirage route with Hasura, seeing how lightweight I can keep it just to keep it fast. And in JavaScript, you're running the actual Hasura backend, so you don't have to re-implement anything. But like, if you do go down this route, like you kind of do have to re-implement Hasura just to test it. It's kind of silly. You usually keep it a lot lighter, so the cost is like a fraction of actually the production level there. But anyways, just kind of the point that Jay is making is like, if I have to mock all this stuff out, then like I'm just re-implementing a fake Firestore. Some I'm sure are using the incomplete community ones. I might too, but I was checking first if I'm missing something. Yeah, I'm also at a point in like coding with open source stuff that I'm just like, I just hate. It's like I hate using open source stuff because. Don't you feel the same way? Like I remember when I started coding, I was like, hit a problem, find some package. Oh, it already does it. Throw it in. Now I'm just like, I don't want anything to do with that because I know it's just going to rot,
because you know exactly.
You know
Dude, this
exactly
just
what's gonna
happened
happen.
with. Yeah, I needed to use React Use in a project. I actually wanted to talk with you about this, but I didn't want to do it like on air in public.
Yeah.
But here we are.
Yeah. Look at us. Who would have thought?
React Use it's awesome. It's a bunch of React hooks that all the hooks that you're like, oh, I could implement this myself, but I'll introduce 50 different bugs.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
React Use has all that stuff. And man, you go in there and there's an issue and this guy's just like, I'm not maintaining this anymore.
Yeah.
Like he's like, no one listens to me. I'm not maintaining this. And he's like, goodbye.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now this thing has this library, I think it's like over 300 GitHub issues.
Yeah.
Now,
Never use it again.
keep
Well, I already
adding
hit a bug on it with one of the use measure things, and I found a little React use measure maintained by the Point Manders guys, and so now I'm never going to use React use again. You know.
Nice. But yeah, this is the thing. Like I want it. Like I love paying for Heroku.
Yeah.
Because it costs next to nothing. And I know they make a shitload of money, and that
they're not going to stop maintaining
servers
it.
running.
Yeah.
They're not going to open an issue that says no one listens to me.
I know.
Sorry,
It's ridiculous.
I'm giving that guy a hard time. I shouldn't be. I know what it's like, man. I do.
I do too. Oh man, that's great. No one listens to me. Peace. That's funny. Anyways, like, circle back here to the thread. He was saying, like, do I re-implement a fake one? Do I use a community one that's not going to be maintained? Blah, blah. Steph said, yeah, I firmly believe if you provide a library or a service that users rely on, making testing easy is critical. In fact, it may need to be designed from the start with that in mind. And he said he's worked on systems, and the cost of not doing that was high enough in terms of the design that it was like insurmountable. So, you know, something else you and I talked about was like, once I went through and refactored my use auth thing and ended up with something that I liked, I was able to not have to change the public interface of my React hook, but the way I integrated it with my test provider and my Firebase provider changed. And so you could imagine if that was like an open source hook or some code provided by a business that provided some service, testability would change it. And I mean, even with Firebase, right? Firebase is in the middle of working on like SDK 9. You still import Firebase, which has a side effect. Like you wouldn't do that today. That's just because they made it before there was even ES modules, but no one would do that today. They make it so it doesn't blow up if you're like in the server or whatever. But it has a ton of side effects that you import, so it makes it hard to avoid that code path if you don't want it. And yeah, of course it would change. It would change a lot of your interfaces and everything. So that's kind of like a bummer.
Yeah.
You know, in the sense that a lot of these things don't have really good docs pages or stories on testing. And it's like, well, that kind of sucks. Yeah. So it's interesting. Yeah, man. I don't know. Obviously, we're in the JavaScript space. We do like JavaScript consulting, but like basically every team we work with for, I don't know, 3 years now or something, 4 years has front end and back end teams separate. They have miscommunications about the API. They have to stream these things together in some way. And then when you come to testing, it's always this question: do I mock this? Do I get it running? How do I hit the real thing? There's pain points on both sides. But like you said, even Rails or Laravel teams who are using more services are going to have to deal with this stuff too. You know, a lot, like when we first started working on Mirage and using it back in the day with like with Ember and Rails and JSON API, you know, you follow a convention there. It was relatively painless to mock it because you followed a convention. And with Hasura, what's even cooler is like I've seen people go down the mocking route, whether they're using Mirage or MSW or something else, and they end up doing a lot of work. It's not really worth it. But what's cool about Hasura and GraphQL is you have the schema, so much of that work just making sure that your kind of mocks are in line with the actual API content, like way easier. And you know, you can imagine the way, like if Firebase provided some mocking stuff, you know, Hasura could too. Hasura could provide either something that would work with a tool like Mirage or just their own thing that basically reproduces it. And you could just auto-generate it from the schema the same way. But I think that'd be my preference if I could snap my fingers, just because there's a nice clean boundary there. It's faster. There are a lot of details you can avoid during testing and during local dev. A lot of concerns that you don't need to worry about, that really simplifies and speeds you up. You don't need to worry about database indexes, and for most of us, most of the time, don't have to worry about a lot of complexity.
Especially during testing. I mean, Hasura tables, like if you're a product manager at Hasura, your tables have to work with 1 record, 10,000 records, 100,000 records.
Yeah.
For developers that are writing tests,
I
mean, we don't care if it works with 100,000 records.
Exactly.
Unless we're like testing that.
Right, but that most people don't. Right. And same with auth, you can just return a bogus token. You don't have to, JWT setup is like a huge pain in the butt. So I do like that general approach a lot of times, but again, there's trade-offs, and it's just, it bothers me about it also just, the JavaScript community is so being fragmented makes this even harder. There's a lot of lessons that we still have to learn from Rails stuff.
Yeah. I think the issue here is services, and services make it so easy to do certain things, but we're, they make it harder to test. So
I'd be curious to see like what, Vercel's dashboards test suite looks like, or other teams building data-driven apps with Next.js look like. Because we're getting a lot of requests for Next apps too. Like that's basically all we've been working on for what? I don't know.
Oh,
coming up on a year or something.
6 months.
Yeah. I mean, 6 months. But like we've had other people ask us about that. So anyone building a Next has, by definition, a service as their backend, right? I guess unless they're using like Prisma directly in API routes and writing stuff there.
Yeah.
Which you could do, but
right.
I'm guessing most people using Next
what services.
Yeah.
I would say like most people are credit card payments. Like no one's processing the credit card payments themselves, so they're probably using Stripe or Authorize or something.
I guess the data layer is really the big dog, right? Because it's so generalized and has to respond to so much.
Yeah. Yes. Because like you said, it's like Hasura is like a query language.
Right.
You can't just mock out 4 different little things.
Right.
Well, I guess what does Rails do there? They have...
You don't mock in. Use the real thing. Yeah, and they have a great API for...
And you have factories.
Yeah.
And a great API for resetting.
Yep. Yeah, database. That's the thing. Database cleaners. It's all the stuff you said. Like, you could take that position, but you're going to spend weeks writing, weeks over your free time. Yeah.
Dude, I have been spending weeks. We have been spending weeks writing this.
Exactly.
Both of us. So.
Database cleaner doesn't exist as a plug and play thing in Rails. All those little pieces. Factory bot doesn't. Factory library is hard.
Okay. I'm getting what you're saying now about like the community, Rails community versus JavaScript community, right? Because if you were to ask someone like, how are you doing factories in JavaScript, you get 17 different answers.
It's like you said, Postgres is a service, but because of the coalescence of the Rails community around a few conventions, you just slap on database cleaner and factory bot, and you have clock stuff that can move the time back and forth, or even built into Rails. All that stuff.
It's a Ruby library called TimeCop. I think it's the coolest library. TimeCop.freeze.
Yeah, exactly. And like Cypress has some of that stuff, but again, it's just those things work really well together. I'm sure the Laravel community is the same way because they they share that stuff, and a lot of it's provided directly by the framework. So yeah, that makes it tough.
Yep.
I think the mocking stuff and the stuff that's taking us a while is not like, it's not essential complex. It's not essentially a hard problem to solve. It's the kind of problem that needs a lot of time and eyes. And so you basically, when you go into these things, and like Jay said, and it's not like I'm missing something obvious. I mean, Jay works at Netflix, or used to. Like, we're not idiots. You know what I mean? There's just no happy path there. And so if you go down this path and you want to do testing, then you're going to end up feeling like you're writing a lot of like non-app code, library code, just to get your app in a spot where you can work on it and test it locally.
Dude, that's great, because we can absolutely describe what we need for our test to
Yeah.
work, but to actually write it takes weeks.
Yeah.
And so it's not like, yeah, you know what I'm saying there?
Totally.
Like,
Yeah. Well, that's why I've been having fun. I mean, to be honest, writing this stuff, because it's just like abstract and it's the kind of stuff that programmers love writing, like not working on the actual app. Right. But I did want to invest in what some cleaner code here would look like to make it more reusable, because I want to end up with something that I copy from project to project. And I'm happy with this. And then also I'm just curious what it's like to mock out in maybe a more general way the Hasura stuff for the same reason. So it'll be interesting to see. But yeah, it's kind of crazy, man. I don't know. It's interesting. You know, it's actually with the folks we've worked on who have different teams, or sometimes we work with teams who are just doing the front end, and the back end is not even something you have access to. It's the same exact problem there. You know what I mean? That's actually an interesting situation, because you don't even have the option to run the back end locally. You have to mock it out. You literally don't have access. Let's say for proprietary reasons. We worked with teams like that before. You can't get it. And so you have to mock it out. And then I guess the question, like the debate in my head is like, you know, for like the DHH folks who are like the majestic monolith or whatever, they're like, oh, you went down the wrong path to begin with. Like, just kind of dismiss its entire architecture. But, you know, feels like there's a lot of teams moving there for, you know, some reason or another. And it's like, given that's the state of the world, I'd really like to see this story improved, you know?
Yeah. I was going to say, like, when we work with those teams, like, the way they get around this is like, they're not writing a Hasura that works in all these different situations. Right. Like, they're writing their own, they're basically writing like their own protocol, you can imagine, because they're coming up with the different responses for everything. You know, it's HTTP, but like the shape of the data is not like
standard.
Hasura, no matter what Hasura instance I'm using, I always have like a, you know, find by PK.
Right.
Where this, it's custom. And so the way they get around this is they just communicate back and forth, and they give back end team can give the front end team enough information to mock.
Right.
But
to varying degrees of success. It's hard. I mean, it's hard. Everyone's making up. Again, it's like, yeah, it's problems you literally don't have to worry about when you have things together, you know?
Yeah.
But, you know, I'm guessing, presumably, all these teams aren't moving to distributed front end and back end, you know, SPAs with React and then different back ends just because they like Dan Abramov's hair or something like that. Like, there's real reasons beyond hype that they're making SPAs or JavaScript front ends, you know?
Yeah, I mean, exactly, dude. If we were working on monoliths right now, we'd be having a podcast about you know, how great microservices are, and wouldn't it be awesome if we could just spin up a service?
How painful this huge app is getting, or I don't know.
Yeah,
you know how long it takes to change
45 minutes
CSS.
to boot up.
Yeah, how long? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting. Cool.
I think it's just to wrap this up. I think it's a good thing that like we're not just moving like one or two things to services. It feels like everything is moving to services.
Yeah, because then you have to approach the problem head on.
Yeah. And yeah, exactly. This is not something you can just ignore for like, oh, I can just ignore this because the only service I'm using is Stripe.
Yeah.
As we move like auth and data and credit cards, payments, everything out. I think, I mean, just the fact that we're having this discussion.
Right.
I think that there'll be more eyes on this and yeah, I hope so.
Right. Me too. I would like to talk or share some of the technical details around the seam or whatever. We don't have to get into it right now. We're basically out of time now, but maybe I'll post something or I'd like to make a video about it at some point, or just post a blog post, because, you know, there's a lot of little tricks. You're doing things in module scope. You have the concern of like your apps running in the server and the browser and in test and in non-test. You know,
to the fact that imports are static.
Yeah.
So you can't just at runtime say import the test provider. You actually have to import all of them. So you have a nice, clever way of getting around and dealing with that.
Exactly. And then even the last thing, which was like, just what interface I landed on, which I still might change a little bit, but Firebase gives you an on-off changed. So you want to think about it kind of in a reactive way, I guess, because the auth status could change for some other reason than loading the app or you clicking login. You could click it elsewhere. So, but from your perspective as a developer, if you could just like npm install like a use auth and it worked for you, you'd probably want some initial fetch because you want initially when the status is like unknown or something to show a spinner, let's say. So, it's kind of like, and if that's a promise, you want to be able to throw that for suspense. So you want some promise associated with the initial fetch, whereas Firebase doesn't have like an initial fetch. They have a callback that runs every time the auth status change. So how do you translate that into a promise that you can use from the auth store and say, here's the initial thing that a provider could throw, stuff like that.
Yep.
I'm happy with what I ended up with. It's cool. But yeah, so I'd like to share some of that stuff eventually. And we've seen like similar kind of auth hooks used in the last few projects too. So I think a lot of people are doing this,
Mm-hmm.
It is just one final fleeting thought. Like it is interesting. A lot of these like company people are trying to turn the open source stuff into companies to make it sustainable, which is good, but it means a lot of companies can't use it. So in the past, you'd have Sidekick, and like every Rails app would use it. Let's say now eventually maybe you do need to pay for a pro version, but a lot of people would use it. But now you have like that background jobs as a service, which you communicate with over an API. That's basically you have to pay for it. And so a lot of companies are just not going to do it for whatever reason. That's kind of interesting,
Yeah. I mean, I kind of think this stuff, like, it's funny. I've been toying with like the Google Cloud the background over HTTP. So you basically send an HTTP request that fires a function that you upload to Google Cloud that's a long-running function. And I don't know. I feel like if I like use this a few times and I have like success with it, I feel like I'm just going to be like bringing this in. This is what I bring with me. And it's, it's cheap because like the great thing is like Google and AWS have figured out a way to do it is, shared resources and pay as you go. So you're not just paying $900 for Sidekick for a thing you're using to send like a welcome email.
Right. So, that's true.
Yeah. I like it. I there's a lot of open source that I use and I like that.
Yeah.
I really want the people that write that. They're providing so much value and I want them to be able to capture that value. And I wish there was a way where they didn't have to create like side businesses. I've heard like Adam talk about this, where like he has Tailwind and Tailwind UI, and it's like, so he has an open source project and a business. So he's doing like two things. I wish there was a better way to just pay.
Just sell code.
Yeah. And, I know I know that people have attempted to try to do this, but there's so much
do it.
I mean, obviously, dude, these people that are writing these open source frameworks are powering so much of the app, and they're making my job so easy, like easy. So of course I want them to capture all that. Anyway,
interesting.
Okay,
cool. All right. Well, if you have any thoughts on any of the stuff we talked about, if you are writing tests for services, I'd love to see some examples or just hear your ideas. Tweet at us at Front End First FM on Twitter. Otherwise, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
See ya.
Bye.